Hey, good day, Radio Free Pizza Gourmets. I have in the house today a man I like to call Mr. RC because he reminds me of Royal Crown Cola. But this is Colin from the Indie News Network. How you doing, Colin?
Good. How are you, Zach? Pleasure to
Ah,
be here.
doing, thank you very much. So, I guess just to get started, I'm wondering how you got started with INN. I don't know, like I learned quite a bit about how indie got started in the independent media, but I've never heard it from you. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious.
Um, the simple answer is Indy asked me. I have known Indy. We were a part of actually Richie Medhurst's Discord. I happened to follow him like during the pandemic more so. And from that, I discovered his Discord group that he started. So I checked that out, and then through that, I knew like a couple of people pretty intimately. I would say, like Indy, sort of. Knew who Indy was, but I knew he was a curator for independent media at the time. Just kind of heard about him in passing or whatever. Most people would know me just as far as on Twitter. Mostly just I had it for a long time, but I rediscovered it in light of the advocacy work I was doing in 2019, and I was just kind of getting, just sharing my thoughts on at that time, kind of growing or kind of understanding more about politics and all that kind of stuff. So I was just kind of sharing a lot of kind of what I was thinking online. And from that, just kind of getting connected to Richard's Discord group and kind of sharing, my personal thoughts and like having those conversations on that. So India's known me for a while, at least um, from 2020. And then I've had the idea of wanting to start my own channel actually, um, like around 2021, the beginning of 2021. That was when Forced to Vote was, kind of getting heated up. I was somewhat connected with Jackson Hinkle at the time. I actually invited him to his house, my house, where I was living at the time, in order to help assist with the protest that I helped to plan at that time. Yeah, that's actually how, like, I don't think a lot of people know that or remember that, but I was actually one of the organizers for Force to Vote.
Wow, yeah,
Um,
I had no idea.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So I had to like given that I was in DC and at the time Jackson was in California, like I had to work on getting the permit, and which was kind of a process because January 6th was on the horizon. The police didn't, people that I spoke to when I was getting the permit, they didn't ask me, but they implicitly asked if we were connected with January 6th. And so at the time, it's like, no.
Wow.
Um, they gave us a lot of issues as far as the permit for that, but then January 6th happened, and then and then like obviously they were just like, we will open Congress for y'all or whatever. Um, so but I had a lot of downtime, and I was just talking to Jackson, just in terms of like wanting to talk more about, my experience or kind of bring things in the space in terms of my perspective as, being a teacher, but then like also being a Black immigrant from Europe by way of the Caribbean.
Mhm.
And, sharing that perspective, online. And he actually was one of the few people initially who said you should go for it because I was definitely intimidated with the idea of, doing, I've looked to people like Nico House and like Jackson at the time, and then like RBM was beginning to grow at that, or just was beginning to start later that year. So these were commentators that I was watching regularly and kind of really looked up to. And while I kind of had the idea of maybe doing that myself, I was scared to just the idea of kind of putting yourself out there and having people kind of critique you in terms of, your opinions and what your beliefs are. And, you are putting yourself out there. So me being more of an introvert didn't necessarily want to put myself out in that way, um, but I got the encouragement from a few people, and Indy included, to pursue that. And so I actually started my own channel in October 2021. I haven't done anything with it as of now, but I think Indy was waiting to actually have me do something before he formally asked me, what, I am looking to start a network of new creators and, just give people an opportunity, to come together, be a community, share resources, share ideas. And I would love to have you on as like one of the founding members of the network. And at the time, I was still kind of about, being a part of a network per se.
Mhm.
But the idea of, being in accountability, but then not doing this by yourself kind of appealed to me. And
Mm.
learning the stuff as I go also kind of appealed to me. So that was kind of when I said, yes, sure, I'll be willing to be a part of the network. So we launched in November 2021. And then from there, I was asked by Reef Breland, my co-host in INN News, to actually do INN News in March, with the idea of, given my content was more specific to, I wanted to talk more about issues in Africa as well as within the Black diaspora at the time. That's kind of a niche topic.
Mhm.
And they wanted to give me more of a platform to kind of talk about stuff more regularly. So it just gave me a way to kind of talk about issues that are more connected with us in America per se, and Europe. Just giving me more of an opportunity to do that more on a regular, while also giving me an outlet to kind of talk about those issues like in Africa and everywhere else, like in the African diaspora, that are important to me, that I want could highlight on the show as well. So yeah, that was kind of my journey, starting from during the pandemic, actually. um, just being kind of a somewhat fan and kind of in admiration of people who were willing to do this, to now
Mhm.
actually doing it myself and being able to do this every week. It's hard, but it's a great way for me to kind of get in tune with what's going on politically, that I always say that I want to use what I know to kind of enhance the work that I'm doing, obviously being a teacher, but then like
Mhm.
obviously kind of being more aware of the issues that are kind of pertinent to people, that I can help to elevate those issues, especially in terms of my job, more so. But yeah, that's how I got started with INN.
Oh, well, great. Thank you for sharing. There are a lot of things that you've just said that I would love to touch on, but I'd like to start with your job. Being a teacher, and with Trump coming into office tomorrow again,
Mhm.
and having said, I believe he plans on defunding or making some major changes to the Department of Education. You would certainly know more, I think, than I do at this moment. But I'm wondering what your expectations might be, or any
Well,
fears in that regard.
the, anyone who says that they have an idea of what that means, in my opinion, is a liar. Because I we don't know exactly what that means yet, in terms of what dismantling, if it happens at all, number one.
Mhm.
Um, but what would that mean in terms of how our education is will progress definitely within the next 4 years. What
Mhm.
people are suspecting is going to happen is there's not going to be as much funding for public schools and then vulnerable populations. You can think of SPED in particular. So having to do a lot more advocacy for that to ensure that we're able to meet the needs of our most vulnerable populations, in our schools. That will probably be something. Well, we should be doing this anyway, but it's just a lot more elevated now. Our immigrant population is also going to be at risk.
Mhm.
And our concern is, or at least my concern is, agencies like ICE and all these other Homeland Security agencies will be more or less forced to possibly pull out our immigrant populations out of our schools, to send them back to their original countries or whatever. So it's the idea of, are we as teachers able to kind of stand as a shield to protect
Mhm.
these students? I I said this to several people, especially given that I live in DC. Um, we don't have those such protections, compared to like a lot of other states do.
Mhm.
Um, I guess regarding the of home rule law here,
Mhm.
we're kind of susceptible to anything that the federal government does. And I see, like our mayor kind of, and I get not necessarily wanting to work, but having that type of diplomacy against the incoming administration. I definitely understand that, but I also feel like there has to be a stance where certain things that he may want to do would be non-negotiable. Like, what are the things that our leadership in DC in particular are going to stand up against to him in terms of protecting uh, our youngest citizens in DC and by extension the country. So I how I interpreted all of this just basically means a lot more being loud and being uh much making more noise in terms of the needs of our students in our schools, which we've been doing this work, at least for me, been doing this work anyway, but
Mhm.
just having to be a little louder about it. But the thing I tell people is, um, I think it would be a lot easier to kind of do this advocacy work or want to be activated to do this work because Trump is president. Um,
Mhm.
the real the the real test that I bring out to people is, well, what about when a Democrat is president? Are you going to bring that same type of heat? Um, so I just kind of see it in terms, not to say that there aren't people who do that advocacy regardless. I'm one of them, and I've been doing this kind of work on the ground consistently now for the last 5 years. So I've been doing this work regardless, but I don't want um, the come latelys now being like, oh, we got to stop Trump. Yeah, we got to stop Trump, but this work has been happening prior to Trump, and it's going to happen once Trump leaves the office in 4 years from now. Are you going to have that same type of energy in 2029 of whoever is in power? Like, are you going to just dust your hands and be like, okay, I'm going to go to sleep for another 2 to 4 years? Or are you going to
Mhm.
continue to do this work regardless of who's in office? Because as much, yes, it's like the stakes are a lot higher, but for a lot of our low income and a lot more vulnerable communities, they've been in dire straits forever. So
Mhm.
so I think just really from what I know for sure, it's just our advocacy work is going to be a lot more intense. It's going to be a lot harder. And we have to be a lot louder and a lot more unapologetic in terms of stances that we've had this whole time, and just being willing to kind of take a stand against whatever Trump throws at us in particular. So I'm not entirely sure what that means, to be quite honest, as far as him or what attempting to dismantle, um, you know, the Department of Ed. But
Mhm.
we'll see what that means potentially within this administration. But I will also argue that it wasn't necessarily um, roses with the Democrats either. So, like, you can argue there was less advocacy that may have needed to be had, but funding, especially for schools, is still an issue.
Mhm.
Funding in terms of ensuring that all of our most vulnerable students are getting the services that they need has always been an issue. I think in light of COVID, when a lot of that funding that was given, specifically for the pandemic has been stripped,
Mhm.
and having to kind of go back to, pre-pandemic issues and funding without necessarily the support of the federal government, and certain states are not able to, like, have that kind of be able to kind of take care of all of that on their own. Like, that's where, a lot of that federal dollars are going to, supposedly. But, so that was a long way of saying I don't know. Uh, but all I could say is right now is anyone who's a true activist, this is like, okay, this is the work that we're doing anyway. So we
Mhm.
just have to go possibly a little bit harder, um, but with the intention of we want to see full justice in terms of having our children educated, regardless of zip code, regardless of status, regardless of race. We
Mhm.
want to ensure that we have a viable education system in this country that benefits all. So that's the ongoing work that I'm committed to, and others like me are committed to. So it really doesn't matter who is in the White House. The work still.
All right, understood. But you mentioned the come latelys that you called them. I'm just curious because you're in the DC area. I don't know if you're planning on, it being involved in a protest at the inauguration tomorrow or anything like that. But have you noticed already that there's an upswell of anti-Trump protesters as opposed to pro-education protesters? If you understand the distinction I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I definitely do. And yes, I have noticed. I've definitely seen. Well, I'm kind of affected right now because streets are closing not so far from me, because the inauguration. So I'm limited to travel anywhere up until Tuesday. But I, I mean, I've done plenty of protests here, but I
Mhm.
also, and talk about this with Indy all the time, and um, I'm sure I'm going to get flack for saying this, but I, I kind of question how effective protests are in this
Mm,
day and age. Is it a good thing to do? Sure. But the thing that I always argue as far as protests, what's next? Okay, you're
mm,
going out there, you're making your voices known, you're making your claim or whatever. What's the next step? Like, it just seems to be, not to say symbolic, but it just seems um I'm not sure what the word is at this point, but it
mm,
seems like more like it's just a response. And I think for many people, they feel like that's the only response that they can give, which I can kind of understand.
mm,
But I think we need to kind of start talking about other ways of how we can actually force our leaders to actually do something for the betterment of the people. Um, I remember in 2020, when I was a part of the George Floyd protests, I remember seeing, I should have taken a picture, but I saw Kamala Harris, not far from me, just standing like in the midst of all of the protesters just to take a picture, and then she left.
Mm.
So, so it's like the idea of, a lot of our politicians use so-called movements or, uprisings as a way to kind of, um, kind of show solidarity, quote
Mhm.
unquote, when it's just more or less a photo op or just a way to kind of show that they care without meaning it. And so my thing is, how can we get our politicians scared to actually make the moves that they should in order to serve their constituents? And I don't believe at this point protests work. Not in the same way compared to, back in the 60s when I would argue they were actually probably a lot more effective, but they've wised up now and they switched it up. So, they changed their tactics to sympathize with people and they might talk about it for a moment, but that doesn't lead them to do anything because, corporations force them to think or um, say certain things that are against what people want. So I think we just need to think of other ways of actually hurting the establishment versus just protesting.
Mhm.
And I say that because I understand the value in it, but at the same time, you have to question. Like, I mean, we've seen what's happened with Gaza, and even just with the wording of like a ceasefire, I argue is literally the floor. Like, they're not calling for a ceasefire; they're really wanting liberation. They want
Mhm.
freedom. And I'm not necessarily hearing that, especially in mainstream media. It's the idea even now in regards to ceasefire. It's like, oh, we won. Seemingly, it's like, no, they haven't. Like, because we've seen what Israel has done, like in the past. Yeah, they might agree to a ceasefire for a few weeks or a few months, but then they're just going to go right back to doing the same old in Gaza and the West Bank. So so the idea that we're calling for a ceasefire really is, it's literally just a first step. Like,
Mhm.
what should amount to from the ceasefire after that? And that's what people are not necessarily talking about or asking in the mainstream. So, so but I say that because in terms of the protests that I went to, everyone the chant was ceasefire now, like, and that really isn't enough. The idea in this case is liberation. And the idea for us, if you want to make that connection, is liberation in terms of whatever that means, in terms of, like you can fill in the blank, universal health care, or like, like guaranteed housing, or, a living wage, or a jobs guarantee, like the things that, will make people actually, feel like, oh, I'm actually doing something in terms of feeling like connected in the community that I live in and in the country that I live in. You're not necessarily talking about. Well, mainstream is not necessarily talking about. So, so just making those connections in terms of liberation and what does that mean, for the working class in particular. Like, those are discussions that we need to have and kind of bring it up in terms of what is the end goal for us.
Mhm.
So I don't necessarily hear those talks necessarily, and part of the reason why I wanted to be a part of independent media, especially now, is having those conversations and actually engaging people in terms of what can that look like now, or how can we push for those things in 2025, and then in a way that actually makes our politicians scared and like, oh, if I don't do this, then I'm fucked. So yeah, so I yeah, I see the protests. I I have trouble going to them now, honestly, because
Yeah.
I feel them. The word I was looking for was performative. That's kind of
Mhm.
what it seems to me. It's just like, okay, yeah, you're out there, but what will amount from that after? how are you going to engage the masses in terms of what you're looking or what you're wanting?
Mm.
So, and until our politicians are scared, to me, it doesn't mean anything, at least in my case anymore. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna stay home.
All
I
right.
I'm gonna stay home. Well, I'm staying home tomorrow. Like, there's no point. Not to say
Mm.
there's no point. If you have that desire to go out there and protest, go for it. I'm not gonna tell anyone not to. But
Mm.
I'm just saying, for me, I'm just kind of. It's not gonna necessarily need. I'll be surprised if it does, but it's not gonna necessarily lead to anything in terms of changing the way things are done, unless you're talking about ways to actually destroying the establishment's hold on our government.
Mhm.
So it just seems very symbolic to me without the necessary bite it needs to actually cause change.
All right. I totally understand that. And it's funny, I guess, that you mentioned protests in the 1960s being so much more effective because Martin Luther King Jr. tomorrow. So
Right.
uh, this is good to think about, although I don't have any immediate answers as to how to make these protests less performative and more effective at actually establishing change.
Right.
Um, I am I'm curious because you mentioned the George Floyd protests. Do you regard those as having had uh, like good effect, as having I ask because I was in Minneapolis at the time,
Mhm.
so I lived through all of that, and um, seeing what might be typically performative protests turn into riots is very disheartening.
Yeah, I'm kind of mixed on that.
Mhm.
Um, I still feel there was potential there.
Mhm.
Um, but the example that I use is the NBA in
Oh,
terms of, they were willing to strike, and then Obama swooped in and kind of placated like LeBron James and by extension the NBA not to strike. And my argument with that is, at that point, and I'll give you a prime example. Like, I didn't realize how um I had spent some time in Africa
mhm.
uh like over 12 years ago. I lived there for like 5 months back in 2011, and
Oh,
I did I worked at a children's ministry at the time, and there was a family group that I was connected with that, I kept still, sorry, some of them, like, still keep in contact with. And during that time, it was a tough time for me, as, a Black person living in this country. And at the time, no one was really kind of checking in on me, at that moment in time when that first happened. But I remember the first conversations, the first people that actually checked in on me were my Ugandan family, essentially, over there.
wow.
They called me, some of them, or via Facebook or whatever, and they asked me, "Uncle, are you okay? Like, we saw what happened, in the States." And that was kind of when I realized, oh, this is actually like a bigger deal than normal, because if they are seeing it, and these are not like city kids that have access to the internet in the same way that we do. These are like children who live, or adults that live in the bush, where internet is not as you're not as well connected, like living in the more rural areas of Uganda. So the idea that even they heard about it and saw it and had, you know, the the courtesy to check in on me to see how I was doing was huge for me, and but it was kind of an educational thing for me at that time too, to kind of share with them, because when I was living there, there was a lot that I couldn't necessarily say, given um and I don't want to go into it, but basically, like, the leadership of the children's program was like, like, you can only say certain things about America, which being and they were mostly white that they were saying this to me, a
Uh,
Black person. So it was kind of like, I had this kind of tug and pull, like in terms of like sharing the reality with them of what it's really like in America. And then like they had a very, I wouldn't say skewed, but it was a very Western way of thinking in terms of what many of them thought America was. And for me, trying to kind of say, it's not like there
Yeah.
was that struggle there. So when that happened, that was actually the time when I was able to say, this is what I've been trying to tell you as far as the reality of what it's like here,
Uh,
so you were able to see that and know that it's not, there's a whole side to this country that people are not necessarily telling you or telling you in full. And so from that, I was able to share the stuff that I, in a way, was kind of withheld to share for
mhm.
like that last decade, with them. And a lot of them are now grown, and a lot of them are, some of them are living in other countries now for work. So they're beginning to see a little bit more of the world and kind of making the association with the West that, that I made when I lived in Uganda and came back, like this country is shit. But going back to the George Floyd protests, so like
Mhm.
going all that to say, with the NBA, the NBA is watched worldwide. So the
Uh,
idea that Obama was able to and essentially stop that and to kind of bring more awareness on the world and the right stage. Not to say that wasn't happening already, but I think the idea of the NBA players striking in solidarity of George Floyd, in my mind, could have been, and not to say that would have solved everything, but that would have added more to the conversation. And the idea that Obama stopped that, I was kind of like, this is
uh,
capitalism and corporatism and the establishment at work, that they used Obama as a tool
mhm,
to essentially, instead of giving rise to actually bring out a lot of the issues, especially in the Black community, by extension, the diaspora, in terms of, like the racism, classism that Black people experience in this country,
mhm,
especially at the hand of the police, that was kind of quashed initially with that action by Obama. And
mhm.
so I kind of I've kind of had my issues with Obama, but that was a moment for me where I was kind of like, you're a piece of shit. Like, because that could have been something that could have elevated the Black experience in this country a lot more. That was squashed.
Mhm.
And fast forward to the election 2020, like when Biden won, and I
Oh,
saw people were celebrating, like I couldn't. It was just like people were out in the streets and cars were honking, and I couldn't. It was just kind of like, okay, Trump is gone, but what changes? And I
mm,
felt like the moment that Biden got into office, like this whole talk about Black Lives Matter and all this stuff, and people actually sympathizing with the Black community.
mhm.
Not to say all of it was genuine, but at least there was some talk about that, or people were thinking about it in a little more serious way. The moment that Biden came into office, that all stopped. And
Mm,
so I just kind of felt, so kind of going back to what I was saying before, it just seems that a lot of this protesting and all that kind of stuff seems to be very performative, especially like given, like I saw plenty of Black people at those protests basically saying, oh, we have to vote for Biden in this upcoming election. And I was like, why?
yeah,
It's not like Biden is any better in terms of serving the Black community. I mean, look at his
no,
record. Like
exactly.
what are you basing your assessment on that he would be better for us in terms of the moment? If anything, you should have used that opportunity to demand tangibles from him, and you could take your pick as far as
Mhm,
what that is. I didn't hear any of those talks at all. It was just like, oh, we'll vote for him and then worry about that later, which
mhm,
I'm kind of like, that's not the way to do it. Like, if you want something, you have to be willing to withhold your vote in order
mhm,
to try and get the things that you want. And we saw that, in terms of Kamala Harris in Gaza. I knew a lot of people who withheld their vote for her, myself included. And people are like, well, fuck you. Like, you're making money. I'm like, no, that's not up to me. That's up to the Democratic Party, who claim that they are a party of justice, a party of human rights. And this is one issue among many where, like, if they're talking about, the betterment of people, this is one way they can do it. And again, the idea of ceasefire is, at best the floor, but the idea is, you could have called for a ceasefire. I could have called for a ceasefire anytime over the last 15 months. Like, so the idea that they weren't willing to do that, but they were claiming, they were working tirelessly towards it, is bullshit. So I think for me, George Floyd, I kind of look at that time with sadness, because I feel like that could have been a time when I feel like there could have been more that could have amounted from that in terms of the outrage people were feeling. And I think not everybody, but there were people who at least were able to sympathize more with the Black condition in this country. But I also felt like there was a lot of people in our government and otherwise who stifled a lot of that potential, that there's been no movement since. And so I'm sad about it. It's disappointing that 4 years later, my community hasn't progressed at all. If anything, we've gone backwards since then. Like, there's no George Floyd bill, which is bullshit in of itself, but like, there's been no movement in that. There's no movement in terms of, again, mostly improving the Black condition in this country. And if you want to make the association improving, like lower class people in this country, go off. Yes, exactly that too. But, me as a Black person, I have to sympathize with the things that are happening in my community primarily. And I haven't seen any of that, at all, like in the last 4 years. And so yeah, it's sad for me that it was an opportunity that I think was squandered, in terms of our government, but then also people on the ground that did not, I would argue, do not know how to protest properly, that they weren't making those tangibles to people who it would have made a difference possibly, now, like in terms of having people see the Democratic Party as also part of the problem, if not more so of the problem. But yeah, it's sad.
I agree. Well, I would argue much more forcefully than you just did that the Democrats are a bigger problem at this point in terms of holding back justice for the Black community. Like the clip that always jumps into my head is, I believe you've probably seen it, of Hillary Clinton during the 2015 or 16 Democratic primaries, talking about how Bernie wants to break up the big banks, but what is that going to do about racism and homophobia, etc.? And her saying that made it very clear. Even I wish I had seen her say it then, but I've just seen the clip so many times since then. It made it very clear that identity politics, if you want to call it that, is just used as a prop by the Democrats, a sort of, hey, look over here, and we're not going to do anything about class issues.
Right.
But even me saying that, though, I come off like a big class reductionist. Like, I have a friend back in Minneapolis. He is Eritrean by ethnicity, and so he and I just have this discussion very often about class reductionism versus identity politics, or what I would call identity politics. For him, it's obviously much more something that is part of his community as opposed to me just being a white man. It's for as much as I might regret it, it's I guess harder for me to feel that solidarity as part of my own identity and my own being. And
Right,
therefore I risk being performative in the ineffective way that you were just critiquing.
right. I I had my mind kind of renewed in this, and I think since, or at least I'm more open because sometimes I forget because I live here.
Mhm. Well,
But
please.
my first time that I actually began in thinking about this in terms of the race class issue, because I know especially, I feel within the Black community that's especially apparent because, the idea is that my color of my skin is on the basis of my class, so
Mhm.
um so it's a visual marker for me and other people like me in terms of where I stand, and in the way things are run, in the West.
Mhm.
And, like I said, I spent some time in Uganda back in 2011, and I remember, and I was living in the bush, so it wasn't like I was living in the capital, Kampala, at the time. I was in the bush, but I went to Kampala, like for a day, with the other Americans I was with. There was 5 of us total. We just went into Kampala, just for a day, like a self-care day. Like, so we went swimming and we had some American food and did a little shopping and all of that. So I remember being at the pool, and like being around mostly Black people,
Mhm.
and like, and then I kind of thought about this in my head. I didn't say it out loud, thank God, but like, I thought like, oh, there's no white people here besides the 3 girls that were white with me,
Uh-huh.
the group that I was in. And then like 2 things immediately thought 2 things immediately in that instance. The first thing that I thought about was that instance was probably one of the few times in my life where I wasn't conscious about being Black and how
Huh.
that, and I'm speaking for me, like how that, how that feeling is so oppressive in this
Mhm.
country, especially for me being in more mixed circles, predominantly white ones.
Mhm.
Like, I stand out. So it's like, as I said, this is a visual marker of how people would perceive you. And having to kind of fight against that, that is pressure that, from someone like me, have to experience basically all throughout my life. So it helped me realize, just being around other Black people predominantly, it was just like, and it wasn't to say I was like Ugandan, but like I could pretty much fit in until I spoke, and then they realized, "Oh, you're not from here."
Uh-huh.
I was able to kind of at least hide that, like the marker wasn't necessarily the issue over there.
Mhm.
So the idea was like, that weight is heavy, for,
Yep.
I would argue, people of color in America. And then the second thing that I kind of realized was, in a lot of ways, how privileged I really was, and how racism here kind of blinds people of color to that privilege. Like the idea, and not to say that things are great here, but the idea generally is that you have housing, you have water that once you turn on the tap, you can more or less guarantee that water will come out. Like in Uganda, depending like where you are, there's no guarantee of that.
Mhm.
Like in my case, I had to go to like the well down the road from me and like get a huge ass jerry can in order to go to the well and turn on that tap, or in some cases, drop the jerry can into the well full of water in order to get water for me to either cook or bathe or anything like that. Yeah, that
Mhm.
was kind of the issue. That was the thing that I had to deal with. Like like if you're in the middle of dry season and you're looking for rain, just praying and hoping that it rains so that you don't that you have water to like do all the stuff that you need to do. So those are the kind of things that I don't think these are the things we just kind of accept as, you know, not as a necessity, but these are the things we just accept that is kind of part of our. We don't think about that kind of stuff at all. Like
Yeah.
when those things aren't happening, we freak out. Like when we don't have our internet, we freak out. When we don't have our things, our basic forms of living taken away, we start like we're not having it back or whatever that. Like over there, it's like, oh
Uh,
well, like like we don't know when it's gonna come back, so we're just gonna have to deal with it until it comes back on. So like the things that we kind of consider standard, it's actually a luxury in many cases
mhm.
over there. So it kind of helped me kind of formally renew my thinking towards class and race. And again, it's not, or at least the beginning of it,
Mhm.
but now kind of thinking of it politically is the idea of like, and one example is reparations for Black people. And like, I've been in talks with so many people, like, generally the idea is like people, especially if they're non-Black, understand it. But then in coming to coming to class, it's kind of like, well, why is it that Black people should get reparations, but then like I'm a poor white person, like
Mhm.
I haven't necessarily benefited either. So what makes you special towards me, someone like me? And initially, like I kind of got angry with that kind of stance, but now that I'm thinking about it more and kind of heard from a lot more people, it's like, yeah, you actually have a point, because if we're looking at it from a class issue, we're all fucked over. Now,
Mhm.
you can argue like Black people have specific historical things that have affected us in a unique way, but you can also make the argument for a white person who doesn't have universal health care, who doesn't get a minimum wage, a living wage.
Mhm.
It's kind of within. I wouldn't say in terms of maybe a white person reparations for them, but it's still this idea of, you know, like I think there's a commonality among people in terms of like um from a working slash classist standpoint, that
Uh-huh.
there are aspects of that regardless of who you are that we are not getting that the elite do get. So you can argue there's different levels to it, but at the end of the day, it's still the idea of the working class thing having less, the elite class having way more than probably what they need. And they want us to fight against each other while they're kind of sitting pretty in their coffers or whatever. So I think that's a conversation, and I feel that's going to be a tough conversation that needs to be had, you know, definitely among the well, I think even in terms of reparations, there's a lot of stuff within the Black community that I think we need to kind of get among ourselves, because I'm just hearing in terms of reparations, it's about the money, like cut
Mhm.
the check, especially in certain circles. It's like that's why I hear
Mhm.
when the idea of reparations, in my opinion, is the idea of gaining the generational wealth that was owed to us in terms of building. Well, the idea of building the country I don't particularly like either, because the idea that kind of implies choice when we didn't have one. Like, like we were exploited to bring the country to where it is now. And I do believe that that is a debt that is owed to Black people, not just here, but any Black person living in the West. If you're living in the Caribbean, or if you're living in
Uh-huh.
Latin America, or if you're living in Europe or elsewhere, there needs to be like uh, atonement for all of that. But then
Mhm.
on the flip side of that, in my mind, and this is just kind of stuff that I'm thinking about, use the Black experience as a way to elevate everybody else in terms of the human condition. Like, I think about Palestinians right now, and especially in terms of what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I say to people, like, if you're not talking about reparations for them, then anything else is kind of short of that. Because,
Uh-huh.
so there's kind of a lot. So that's kind of where there's a lot of those intersectionality that is kind of coming in, regardless of who you are. And so I think if we really want to have this be an issue about class, we need to have that conversation as to where reparations for Black people fit into all of that, but then use that as the idea for the universality of, like, what does that mean for everybody else who is not in that elite bubble? That is the assumption that they will get these things naturally, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And that leads me in a adjacent direction. But so, do I have it right that your heritage is Trinidad and Barbados? Is that
Correct.
correct?
Yeah,
Okay,
my parents, are from there. Yeah.
right on. Well, I am interested in your perspective with, I would say, just more of an international Black perspective, I suppose. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you hear, like, what you just said about reparations being more of a global affair, I guess. That's new to me, and it catches my ear. I like the sound of it quite a bit. I'm wondering if you have noticed anything like that in the more strictly African American community, if you get the distinction I'm trying to make.
I mean, again, it's mixed, but kind of what I'm seeing is online, unfortunately, and just
Mm.
the general consensus online is no. Like,
Uh,
the idea is like, okay, we got, well, African Americans would say, okay, we got the idea that you need reparations, but you need to do that within the context of your community. We'll take care of our shit, like in terms of America, you take
uh,
care of your shit, regardless of Europe or whatever. And my argument is, I get that in terms of, like being African American, you are an ethnic group, you are an, I wouldn't say newly created, but you created your own systems in terms of the culture that you created for that was created in terms of the experience, that led you to be here and being raised here. I totally understand that, and I won't knock that.
mhm,
However, there's that intersectionality in terms of, if you look at history, it wasn't Americans per se that brought you here initially. It was the Europeans, because
mhm,
America didn't become independent until 1776. The first ships that landed in Virginia in this country was in 1619. So that
mm,
was over 100 years, 150 years before America became independent, that brought your ancestors over to this country. That's the British, that's the French, that's the Spanish, that's the Portuguese.
mhm,
So my thing is, if you're looking, and I get the idea of looking at reparations in terms of you being an American,
mhm,
but my argument is you should be in solidarity with someone like me who's also looking for reparations in terms of my ancestors in Europe, because ultimately, if you kind of look at the history, it's mostly coming from the same corporations and capitalist systems that affected me, and affected you. The only difference is my ancestors just got dropped off on a couple of different islands before you guys were shipped off a little further. Like, I was just
mhm.
a drop off along the way, so to speak.
Yeah.
So my ancestors were. So, like, I just feel like, and I had a lot of people a lot of Black people who don't agree with that, with my stance. It's like, it shouldn't be. Well, it's the argument. Well, you know, Black immigrants come to this country and they think low of us, and like they kind of take over our systems and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not gonna lie, there are probably going to be a few, like, Black immigrants who do have that kind of stance of Black African Americans. I'm not gonna lie, that's definitely apparent.
Mhm.
But at the same time, but it's the argument of, where does that idea come from? Like,
Uh,
why is it that, Black immigrants are kind of maybe having this kind of thoughts with African Americans and vice versa. I think a lot of it has to do with the media. I think a lot of it has how we perceive each other, and then like, you know, having kind of media dictate to us like African Americans are this, you know, this group of Black people are this or whatever else. And so it kind of brings the idea of like we're fighting against each other, or we're looking at each other with a side eye, when it's the idea of like, I'm not your enemy here. Your enemy is actually the capitalists and the corporatists that are actually gaining money off of our backs, while we are fighting each other over really nothing, in my opinion. And
Yeah.
so I just think it's kind of a tactic in a way to create that separation, which I think is unnecessary and kind of backwards in my opinion. Because if we're more, my thing is, if we're more united in that front, then I feel like a lot of things, there could be a lot more exchanges in terms of organizing and, you know, sharing ideas, or what the talk of what should reparations look like in context of the various countries or regions that Black people live. Like, what I feel like there should be a larger discussion. And so it's kind of, you know, because what I'm seeing is like African Americans are having this little bit here, Caribbean people are having this little bit here, European Blacks are having this conversation here, people in Africa are kind of having this conversation here. There seems to be more of a disconnect to me than rather like, let's pull all those resources together and let's kind of talk about the commonalities that we have among each other, and kind of realize it's all under the same people and corporations that, you know, that are forcing us to be separated rather than be united against them. So that's kind of the way I see it. And I know there's a lot of Black people, African Americans, who do not agree with that stance, and that's fine if they want to have that stance. But, you know, but again, it's like, I feel that there is a way, if we're talking about class, you know, those need to be a conversations that need to be had, especially among our own. And but yeah, that being said, I see a lot of that discourse online, and to be honest, I'm not sure if the people online who are saying all this bullshit are even Black at all. Like, I feel like a lot of them are probably bots or psyops who are probably not Black, who are just saying this shit in order to get like you know, like views off of Twitter or online or whatever else. So that being said, I have talked to, you know, especially close friends who are African Americans, and one person in particular, he may not agree with everything I say, but he does understand the concept of it. You know, and I would argue that he's more right-leaning, even though he's independent. So that kind of shows me like, if we're able to somewhat agree on certain things, especially among that issue, then there's hope that there can be some solidarity in that. If we're able to kind of put our own biases among each other aside and really focus on, if we're looking for this, if we're looking for like reparations, for example, for Black people, like, and that's just kind of the stance I have on that. But you know, yeah, it's like, it's not a popular thing to think about even among Black people, but it's like, look, you can't change who I am. Like, I'm speaking from an international base here, and you know, and for me, it's like, it doesn't make any sense to have this kind of exclusion among a topic that also benefits me too. And ultimately, it kind of leads into the idea of like, this is a class issue, if you want to bring it to that. So how can we have solidarity among each other in order to fight for this issue?
Excellent. Well, you've made me a little curious, because So earlier you were talking about how being at that pool in Uganda, you suddenly realized the privilege that African Americans have compared to people in Uganda, Ugandans, I
Well,
believe.
I will say this in this way because I don't
Sure.
want it to be construed. Like, it's
All right.
relative. Like, I understand, like how, and again, it's not everybody here. So I do want to make that distinction.
Mm,
There's a spectrum of wealth, even among the Black community here. There's a spectrum of wealth in Africa as well. But
mm,
I think the general consensus is that, you know, I think generally anyone in the West may look at an African and say, oh, we may not have it all good, but they're a lot worse than us. And I have to kind of say, not necessarily. Like, there's a spectrum of wealth there, there's a spectrum of wealth here. But I think, again, if you're looking at it from a race standpoint,
mm,
then the idea is, I think if you put that level on it, it's
mm,
like Black people in general here are seen as somewhat less than.
mm.
So then by association, if you look at an African person, then they have even less.
Ah,
When it's the idea of, again, the perception of having less seemingly here, when I argue, and it's not just in Africa, generally in anywhere in the global south, you can make the argument. There
mm,
are certain things, and again, it's not perfect here, but there's more or less a guarantee that you're going to get those things versus down anywhere else in the global south where it's not as guaranteed. That's the
mm,
distinction that I want to make. I don't want to construe the idea or have people think that, like, oh, like, uh we're like, no, but again, spectrum,
mm,
and you see that regardless of race here. But in terms of how that relates to more or less a racial standpoint, there's this level that people, that again is seemingly being placed of where you fit among that racial standing. And
mm,
Black people generally are seen as toward the bottom, I would argue. But it was the idea of that perception, going to another country where a lot of the stuff, again, that's kind of a basic need, is more or less guaranteed for us here.
mm.
So again, it's not perfect, but it's just relative in terms of the experience, like an African who's living in the bush might have. So I just want to make that clarification.
All right, understood. Uh, so where I was going with that was also in reference to your more right-leaning friend who you mentioned a few minutes ago. Um, the combination of right-leaning and realizing that you had a kind of, I'll say, geographical privilege in this case, uh,
Hmm.
it makes me wonder, what do you think of Black conservatives like Candace Owens or Glenn Lowry, I believe. Lowry came to my attention because he and John McWhorter were kind of promoting the idea of the George Floyd protests being a huge psyop and of the killer police being thrown under the bus and so on. And I was just curious what you think of that. I'm oddly fascinated by Black conservatives as kind of like a counterculture example. I guess I'm always
Well,
interested in
I
the
would
form.
kind of argue you should, if you're having that feeling about Black conservatives, you should also have that concern for Black Democrats as well, especially if they're
Mm,
in that elite class. That's the only difference. Like, you're talking about Candace Owens, but we're not necessarily talking about someone like, I don't know, like Bakari Sellers, for example. Like,
yeah,
like, it's the same shit. It's just, again, and you see it right there. It's like, look, at the end of the day, Candace Owens is a rich Black woman, you
mhm,
know? Um, like, to me, it's like, and I think that's the danger that we kind of get into ourselves, I think, in general, but especially within the Black community. It's like, oh, they're a Black conservative, that they're bad, but if they're Black liberal, they're somewhat good. And it's kind of like, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Like, and there could be some things that a Black conservative that can say is true, but maybe shit on everything else, as well as a Black liberal. Like Candace Owens, and I'm going to be fair to her, like, I don't agree with her with a lot of her stances, but she's been correct in terms of what's happening in Gaza. I haven't really
Mhm.
heard of a Black liberal actually kind of having, like, at least in mainstream media, having that stance on Gaza as Candace has, for example.
Yeah,
So,
neither have
you
I, now that
know,
you mention
so it's, to me, again, it's not, and I think those labels, conservative liberal, to me, doesn't mean a whole lot. It
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, when we're looking at it on the like, if we're really looking at it, this is more of a case of privilege and status to me,
Mm.
because a lot of these Black pundits that are actually saying this stuff have some sort of privilege, and I'll argue they're kind of tailored to the white experience. Now, you can argue Candace Owens, she was, like in Ben Shapiro's circle, not so much now, but, she got
Yeah.
her start from that. Conversely, a lot of these Black liberals got their start, depending who you look at, usually through like mainstream media, most notably CNN, MSNBC, like a lot of the media, liberal media, I would argue.
Mhm.
So they both have their issues. I so, I mean, all that to say, I have an issue with Candace Owens in as much as I have an issue with Bakari Sellers, because they're playing for their teams
Oh.
generally, and they're playing for the teams that, as you said, is more or less the identity politics in terms of using their parties as a shield rather than, you know talking about the needs of the Black working class, for example.
Mhm.
Like, so to me, it's a distinction without difference, really. It's just a matter of, like, are they in the same class? And the thing is, for many of them, they probably grew up working class. But then once they got a little bit of money, or once they got a little bit of status, and this is kind of what I see within the Black community in particular, those who are like a little more elevated. And I
Mhm.
understand because I'm one of those Black people. But my thing is, and I think a lot of it is, I have to kind of thank my parents for it. My mom, in a lot of ways in particular, my mom's a nurse.
Oh.
And I grew up with the thought of, like, at least from her and my father, like, take care of your community. Like, no
Mhm.
matter what you do, you should be able to elevate your community in some fashion. So for me, it was the idea of, like, if I'm going to get a little bit of power, how am I going to support and assist other people below me to get at least the same status as they are? I am. Like,
Mhm.
that's kind of the stance that I kind of grew up with. I don't see a lot of these elevated Black boule necessarily
Mhm.
doing that. Or if they do, they'll do it in terms of the people who they're in vicinity with. It's not like they're going to elevate someone like me, like, who is more to the left of any of them, into
Mhm.
those spaces. Like, they're going to try and elevate people who are in similar spaces as them. So regardless of whether they are R or D.
Mhm.
So I yeah, I throw that back. It's not just Candace Owens that's a problem. It's anyone in the Black elite that, especially if there is some sort of media, that is a problem to me. And it's
Uh-huh.
on and you can look at it in different ways. But as I said, it's a distinction without a difference to me. That all of them are problematic in terms of not relating to the working class at all, but using their position to bark at propaganda, which again is taken from mostly white corporations and elites. So they really have become mouthpieces, in my opinion, for the establishment, which,
Mhm.
again, regardless of conservative or liberal, I find that they're all kind of the same to me. So I don't really fuck with either one.
Hmm. All right. Well, I have other questions written down, but they would be like a huge left turn from discussions that we've had so far. So I'm
Okay.
wondering if there's anything that you'd like to shout out, or anywhere that, oh, do you have a website that we should send people to? Anything like that?
Um, well, you can find me on Obona_Collin on Twitter. That's where I'm probably, well, I'm not, I would argue I'm not even really active there so much anymore. But like, if you want to kind of see me on Twitter, that's where I'm at. Mostly though, if you want to watch me, I'm on INN News with my co-host Reed Beelan on Wednesday nights at 9 Eastern, on YouTube as well as Rumble. So I do that show every week. I do. You can also find me if you're looking for a website. Is indie indienews.network. You can find
Mhm.
my links there if you want to follow me in that way. But yeah, I have a very small footprint. So it's not like I have my own, not probably not now, but maybe in the future I will. But yeah, if for people that are looking for me, that's where you can find me online.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. And just before I stop recording, I wanted to go back and say that what you said about being instilled at a young age with the need to uplift your community, very heartwarming. It made me think at the moment, like, oh, this is why they call him Care Bear.
Yeah. Well, no, well, I probably wouldn't say that, but I think but yeah, it's more the idea of like, and I think a lot of it for me is in terms of knowing my history,
Mhm.
and it's just the idea of being able to uplift others and just being able to help others better the human condition. And, both of my parents in different ways have used their whatever privileges they had in being able to do that. And I've been kind of challenged. Well, all of my siblings included have been challenged to do something similar. I think for me, my path is definitely different from my parents in terms of wanting to become an educator, which, both of them were kind of like, not to say that they didn't want me to, but they were kind of like, you know, would that be enough for me in terms of a career, especially being in early childhood? My dad, especially, was like, why the hell would you do that if you can be like an elementary or a high school teacher over anyone else? But I love doing that because one, the idea for a lot of these kids, I might be the only black male teacher that they would probably ever have in their
Mm.
entire life. And so the idea that I'm able to be at the foundation of their educational career, and I just consider my job mostly of how to learn how to be a good person, how to function in this society, essentially, like for my little guys, it's like how to take care of one another and how to start thinking beyond yourself to care about the world that you live in. And so, having the opportunity to do that for our youngest learners, I think is very powerful for me. And I don't take that lightly. And so for me, that's kind of why, especially what we see online, I'm not necessarily interested in, for a lot of people in the space who do that, like political commentating, like if they want to do that as a career, great. But like, that's not me. Like, I not joke, but I often say I just do what I need to do to get on INN News and do that like once a week, and then like I'm out. Like my role is really what I do in the real world, and not necessarily in the Twitter. I don't consider Twitter or any of the social media spaces to be like there are alternate realities, and I don't want to necessarily work in that reality. Not when I have, in my case, 19 kids that I need to advocate for every single day. Those are the people that need me, so so that's where I put the majority of my focus. But yeah, but I think it's the idea of like, I just hate the fact that people get a little bit of power and then they pull the ladder up and not have others try and come up, where they're at. Like we see this a
Mhm.
lot, just generally, especially in this country. But I find it really disgusting, especially among Black people, that we tend to do that with each other. So, so my goal is in whatever little bit of privilege I get, that I'm able to uplift others and be able to help others along so they can get a little closer to, as I said, a bettering of the human condition, of what
Mhm.
we need and I would say deserve. So, but yeah, as I said, I do thank my parents for, in their way, kind of instilling that in me, so that that's kind of been my focus, and hopefully, as long as until I breathe my last breath, that will continue to be my focus, just to make this world slightly better than how I was born into it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. I've had such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for letting me interview you.